This I want to see. Get on video and actually fire a musket here at Fort Niagara.
Ladies and gentlemen, at this time, the musket firing demonstration. You're at point number 1 on your visitor's guide. Once again, at this time, a musket firing demonstration. You're at point 1.
Thanks,
Firing squad.
Which is interesting considering there's a bunch of you and there's one gun.
That
The way this will work is if I go to one end and you're all really disappointed about it. Well, welcome to Fort Niagara. Nice to see you all here. Nice to see that this is sort of like lit up for the time being. I thought this was going to go on a lot longer. Who knows? Around here, you never quite know what the weather is going to be at all. I'll tell you to begin with that I'm dressed as a member of a group that was called Brant's Volunteers, or actually, in fact, a group of European settlers who were living in the frontier in New York, who, when the American Revolution gets started, really don't have any of the political problems with the way life has been going that some people against the Atlantic seaboard had, decided to remain loyal to King, but looked at who they had as people, as loyalist leaders, and decided the best one for them was going to be their neighbor, Joseph Brant, who was a Mohawk war chief. And throughout the course of the war, wherever he goes, there's a group of Europeans running around behind him. More probably, in fact, following him around than there were natives going with him whenever he went any place. Used this place as a base throughout the course of the war once they've been driven away from their homes. The weapon I'm going to use for this is something typical that you would have seen in the frontier in New York, and for that matter throughout the Great Lakes. This is an example of a mid-18th century English trade gun. And it tells us some things about expectations of people at the time, really, in the way that it's constructed. It's a pretty basic flintlock musket. Let's start that out. So when I say musket demonstration, yeah, it's a musket. Most of the customers for these things are going to be Native Americans. And, you know, if you're one of those native warriors and you've been out slogging your way through the wet snow all through a spring, gathering pelts of animals to bring in to trade to get something like this, the last thing you want to get to make a trade for is actually going to be something high-tech, something fancy, something you haven't seen before, because you don't know how it's going to work. You want the same gun your buddy who got one 2 years ago has had, and it's still working every time. So trade guns were purposely made to be as reliable as possible, and last as long as they could. And you know, there's no planned obsolescence here, let's put it that way. The people making guns for the fur trade recognized this was the way to go because it meant, for instance, not having that awkward conversation to explain the return policy later on, right? They knew that the man who was coming to buy one of these was going to come back to get powder and musket balls or lead anyway, and probably if he's been happy with it, he'll come back for beads and fabric and anything else you can think of. So it was a pretty good deal that these things lasted as long as they could. And I'll tell you how long this really is. When I built this reproduction, made it to represent one that was made in 1737. If you walked into a trading post out up against the Rocky Mountains in 1837, guess what? You wouldn't see the difference. Exactly the same gun. That's how for ubiquitous it becomes. There we go. That's the right word. I don't know how far I had to dig to get that one. But at any rate, the reasons for why this is so popular. Heavy wooden stock, thicker in the wood than you might get in lighter guns that were common along the Atlantic seaboard for hunting. Short, so it fit nicely in the bottom of a canoe, or the bottom even, for that matter, a wooden boat, which was popularly used to get here. Long barrels, by the way, really tough if you're running through the woods to try to escape, because you're always going to get that thing stuck on something. Shorter barrels easier for that. Thick in the wrist. This is the spot most likely to break on a gun, and they've made this thick enough that I can just about get my fingers around that. And to help that out, they've extended this brass strap at the back of the trigger guard so it goes all the way down there to reinforce that piece. For a butt plate, rather than the fancy pattern one that you might find on some European guns, a plain brass plate that's just bent over. And what's more, forget screws, which were more expensive to make, but also might come loose eventually and fall out. They've actually nailed these things on, and that's continued right through their history, just be nailed on the gun. Hi there.
Morning.
On the front end of this, we've got a heavy smoothbore barrel. Rifle guns were not particularly popular because they had some limitations. The biggest one really being this. While they're, could be greatly accurate, these are muzzle-loading guns using black powder. If you put the bullet in here at the muzzle, in a rifle it has to fit tight from the beginning to work properly. This means then you're having to push it against the resistance of the groove in the inside of the barrel to set it down tight at the breech to fire back out. And if you've already fired 2 or 3 times, it's getting harder each time you do it because there's more of the fouling or soot on the inside of the barrel. Smoothbore guns don't have that problem. The bullet doesn't have to fit tight. In fact, purposely, while this is a 62 caliber gun, the musket balls made for this would only be 60 caliber. That makes it pretty easy to get that up and down from the inside. Plus, imagine, if you will, you're out in the middle of the woods 100 miles away or more from the nearest trading post when you realize you don't have any lead left, but you still need to eat. Well, you could pick up a rock out of a stream and put it in this and shoot it out, and you're not going to be able to do that with the rifle gun where any oblong kind of shape to it is just going to get it stuck in the inside and maybe the whole thing blows up. So smoothbore, definitely a way to go, but the military used smoothbore guns as well predominantly at the time, but theirs would have lighter, even thinner walled barrels than this would have, because after all, if, they needed a longer one that would still need to be made lighter to weigh about the same amount as this, so that they were going to get more push out of it as the gunpowder burned its way up the barrel, and for that matter, a little bit more accuracy perhaps as it stays on the course of the inside of it. But if a soldier drops one and dents the barrel, there's an armorer that can take it back and pound out the dent and get it ready to use again. If I drop this out there in a stream someplace and put a dent in the side, I got nobody to fix it for me. Now, the next thing, they're using a military-style lock to make this all work. This is still in the flintlock system. Flintlocks were invented about 1610 or so. Paris, as far as I can tell, still used well into the 19th century. And the locks that they were going for on the side of trade guns were made by the same people and at the same standards they made the ones for the military. Soldiers, young soldiers, don't necessarily always take the best care of weapons like this. And on top of that, they have to go out and practice each morning, which involved compressing the springs, letting the springs loose, compressing the springs, letting them loose, over and over and over again. So you don't want the springs to be failing when you're out there trying to survive, so trade guns have got the same kind of springs into their locks as they have in the military guns. Now, on the front, speaking of springs, we've got a little spring here called the feather spring. Feather spring is meant to control the motion of that bit, known variously as the hammer, the frizzen, the frizzle, the steel, or the battery, depending on who you're talking to. Now, the important part is, it's the important part of the gun. It's actually what sets this apart as being a flintlock rather than being a snap-ons. You've all heard of snap-ons, right? Well, we'll put it this way. It didn't last very long because this came along quick on top of it to replace it. This piece is doing 2 things at the same time. The lower leg down here is a cover for the little pan that's behind that and below it, where I'm going to put a little bit of gunpowder to get things started, the priming charge. The upper half of this is the hard piece of steel. We're going to bash with this sharpened piece of flint back here to give us the sparks that should set that off. And flint is so hard. If we had a piece of it here, a round chunk, and laid it on the ground and went after it with a sledgehammer, the first thing we'd probably do was to pound it in the ground. The way to break it is actually hit it with a shearing action, or hit it on the oblique so it breaks off and creates a flat surface as it comes off. Now you keep doing that the right way, eventually you end up with a bunch of these little chips, this is about 1 inch square, that are very sharp on the edges. Now, if we bash this piece of flint with enough force against that piece of hardened steel, it isn't just going to bounce off. It is sharp enough it will actually